Welcome to Grandma Magic, a podcast from the Grandmother Collective. We are a nonprofit organization that supports and advocates for a world where a grandmother's power is seen, cultivated, and activated for positive change. The Grandma Magic podcast is an opportunity to learn more about the unique roles that grandmothers, aunties, and other older women around the world play in advancing positive social development by talking to and learning from grandmother changemakers. We hope this series inspires you, brings you joy, and helps you recognize the enduring magic and wisdom that comes from grandmothers everywhere. Today, we're excited to introduce Stella Fosse, an author who began writing in her 60s as a response to ageism and sexism. Through her books, workshops, and blog, she empowers older women to explore their creativity and embrace their stories. Author of Aphrodite's Pen and Brilliant Charming Bastard, Stella leads workshops on romance, erotica, and memoir writing, encouraging women to celebrate love, passion, and life beyond midlife. Her latest book, Write and Sell a Well-Seasoned Romance, helps women craft vivid stories of love later in life, continuing her mission to champion older women's creativity. Stella, thanks for joining us.
Oh, thank you so much. It's great to be here.
Great. Well, so you know that we always ask this question, and I think it's a softball, but you told me that it's hard. So, what is a tradition, ritual, some important kind of thing that you really want to make sure that you're passing down to the next generation?
I think this is a really tough question. I have 4 kids, and they're all so different from one another. One of them has pretty severe cerebral palsy and has an identical twin who's an attorney in New York City. Those are my boys. And then I have a daughter who is a graphic designer in Portland, and I have a daughter who is adopted from Hanoi, who is way younger than the rest of them. And she is a new college graduate and finding her way in the world. So when I think about passing on a tradition to the 4 of them, there isn't probably one thing that would work for all 4 of them, but maybe I could say a general thing, which is I raised my kids in the Unitarian Universalist tradition. And there are principles in that sort of theological framework that I'm really glad my kids were exposed to when they were kids, before they were in their grown up stage that they're in now. So things like appreciating the interconnected web of all life on this planet, ideas like respecting the dignity and worth of every individual, those are values that I hope my kids, and I believe my kids, are bringing into their 4 very different adult lives. And those basic values translate into things like supporting reproductive freedom for women, supporting the right of people to vote, supporting truth in news, and being able to access factual news that represents the world as it is. So that's maybe kind of amorphous, a hippy dippy answer, but that's as granular as I can get because my kids are living such different lives.
Yeah. I appreciate that you drilled down to the meaning behind things, but I wonder if you could speak a little bit to what does it look like to show what it means to have that interconnected web of life. How do you show that to children or to the next generation? What are the ways in which you have been able to instill those values? Let me give an example. When I was a kid, we always went down to a church that wasn't our church in downtown Phoenix on Christmas Eve. And my parents made sure that we were there at least 10 years. I feel like we did this because that church didn't have a choir. And so on Christmas Eve, we made sure that we showed up with a group of people from this theater that my parents started. Like I come from this like kind of artsy background, and we sang at this church. It wasn't our church, they weren't our community, but it was a tradition that really I think fundamentally shared with me and my sister that we are part of a bigger community. We have a talent and a gift to give, And when you can, you should. And it was like the spirit of Christmas and all that other stuff too. But that's, I guess, like one of the ways that I've been trying to frame this question, I guess I'm really digging in with you today, is what is the mechanism by which we create these values and norms in our communities and in our families?
So when my 3 birth kids were little, we used to serve breakfast at a homeless shelter. And my son, who has CP, is a huge sports fan. And one time when we had served breakfast and we were all sitting at different tables with folks who were having the breakfast, my son sat with a man who showed him his baseball card. This gentleman had been a Major League Baseball player and was now an unhoused person. And that was really all he owned, was this one baseball card from when he'd been in the major leagues. And I don't think my son will ever forget that experience of talking with that gentleman.
So, setting up experiences to take this theory into practice. Maybe you didn't even do it intentionally. It just, because of you already have those values and belief system.
It just was serendipity, really. So that was way at the beginning of their lives. At this point in life, becoming an author who wrote and writes about older women's sexuality, I thought that I would be embarrassing my children. And instead, it turns out that they see this as empowering older women. And my daughters, in particular, are future older women, and they see this as an important thing to do, which is not at all what I expected.
That's where you were going with that earlier. That is such an interesting lesson to learn, that when you put yourself out there, if you've done your job, people trust and love you regardless.
Yeah. And, in fact, my daughter, who's a designer, designs my book covers. I didn't never expected that sort of support and encouragement from my kids. And again, it speaks to how interconnected we all are. No matter what age you are, if you're lucky, you're going to get to be an older person. And I don't think every young person gets that, but perhaps the experience of seeing their mom take on this second career has helped my kids to see that for
Yeah.
themselves.
I always tell people this work with older women is a very healing process for myself, a recognition that I have many lives to live and many directions and transitions to make. So, why don't you tell me about your transition, Stella? What was this journey to taking on a second career, and maybe share a little bit about actually, more about what you do?
When I was in my late 50s, my second marriage ended. And at the same time, I was thinking about retirement. I was in my late 50s. I had been a tech writer in the biotech industry, and then I'd been in charge of a group of folks who were doing that work as I progressed in my career. But what I always wanted to do was write my own stuff. But the thing is, when you have 4 kids and you have the kind of job where if you get an email at 4 in the morning, you're expected to answer it by 7 in the morning, there isn't really time to develop that other writing practice. But in my late 50s, as my kids were moving on into their adult lives, and as I was seeing the light at the end of the tunnel in terms of my biotech career, I started thinking about what I wanted to do next. And it was pretty obvious that I wanted to write books. Around that time, I read an article in the New York Times book review section by a woman romance writer in her 50s who encouraged her sister writers that if they wanted to get published, they should write romance characters in their 20s. And I thought to myself, is that really what I want to be doing? Do I want to be closeted in that way when I do graduate into my own writing career, my own decisions about what I want to write instead of writing for an employer, writing for myself? And The answer was, hell no, I do not want that. And at the same time, I was aghast that the publishing industry could be that ageist, which was naivety on my part because we all know that the publishing industry isn't just ageist, it's also, in many cases, there's a history of racism in that industry, there's a history of misogyny in that industry. It reflects the larger society. So, around the same time, a friend of mine, Lynx Cannon, who writes erotica, started a reading series at a local bookstore. It was called Dirty Old Women, and it happened once a month. And she invited her friends to write erotic stories and come read them in front of an audience at this bookstore cafe in Oakland, California. And I thought, okay, let me put my money where my mouth is. If I really don't want to be closeted, how about if I try this thing? Which was scary, and getting up in front of a whole bunch of people I didn't know and reading a story that had this sort of intimacy to it. And it turned out to be a fantastic experience. It was always packed. Every month the place was packed. And women in their 30s would come up afterwards and say, thank you. Thank you for doing this. We're being told that women's sexuality and romantic lives end at 40. And to hear women in their 50s and 60s and beyond reading stories like you were reading is just such a relief. So we did that for quite a while. And in the meantime, we started a writing group. We started, some of these women from Dirty Old Women would get together once a month, and we called it Elderotica. And we got together and we had writing prompts and snacks, and we read to each other, and we had a great time. In fact, that writing group is still going on. I no longer live in California, but I Zoom into it once a month. And also, Lynx Cannon, my friend, published a collection of stories from that reading series called the Dirty Old Women Anthology. And then another friend of mine has a writing and art retreat that she hosts in Marin County. She does it twice a year now. And I was there, and I happened to sit next to a woman I didn't know. And I said, I'm in this Elderotica writing group, and I'm thinking about writing a book about how to write erotica for older women. And she said, oh, I work at North Atlantic Books, and we'd love to publish a book like that. So that's how my first book came to be. No book proposal, no query letters, just networking. That is the power of older women together, networking. So I put together that book, which is Aphrodite's Pen, The Power of Writing Erotica After Midlife. And that book contains interviews with women writers. It contains sample writing. It contains lots and lots of prompts and ideas for doing your own writing, for starting a writing group of your own. And that's how this career really launched.
I think it's so interesting and beautiful that it started with women gathering, because it seems to me in a lot of the anti-ageism work, and probably the feminist or pro-women work, that we have to prove that there's a market constantly proving the demand is available or is there. And women so naturally gather and naturally support each other in this way, and that ended up being a way to create that demand and prove that there was a market.
And, my new book on writing romance novels includes quotes from reader reviews of the seasoned romance, late life romance that's out there. If you look on Goodreads, for example, and you look at some of the books that already exist, the readers say things like, thank goodness I found this book. There just aren't enough romance novels with older characters. Because the market, speaking of the market for romance novels, half the women who read romance are over 48. But yet, the publishers, until pretty recently, have still been pushing this idea that the characters need to be in their 20s. And I think a lot of women would rather read about characters their own age than their children's age.
Yeah, I don't want to read about people fumbling around in their first romantic. experience.
No, I mean, it's nice if you're that age, but
Yeah, I've already done that. That was uncomfortable. Let's talk about mature
Yes.
love.
Let's talk about people who figured out what they're doing, you know?
Yeah,
Really?
yeah. That was, like, not fun, actually, that period of life. It's a little
No.
more fun, actually, later. Oh, wow. Had you always been interested in romance novels? Were you an avid reader?
No, I'm still not that interested, frankly, in romance novels. For me, this is a political thing, which is interesting. It's weird to say it out loud, you know? I have written one romance novel. So there are people out there, if you look at somebody like Lynn Spreen, who's a terrific writer of season romance, she's written so many. But I took a time out at one point in my biotech career and I got a teaching credential. And I taught English and biology for a while, which is a funny combination. But, you know, I was a tech writer in biotech. And I think that sort of teaching bent is still with me. I went back into biotech because I couldn't survive on a teacher's salary, but that's a whole nother conversation. But yeah, that urge to teach. So I taught a romance writing class online for a terrific organization that unfortunately no longer exists. And I don't think I killed it. I think it, you know, there were other reasons why
Was
that
your
place
romance
my
workshop?
romance no, my romance writing class was very popular. You had to be 65 or older to join this organization and take these classes. And this was sort of a lark. I taught romance writing. I learned all about the genre and what the expectations are. And I taught this class, and these folks were so enthused and they wrote great stuff. And then the organization folded, and I thought, okay, I've got all this material. This was so fun. How about I find a different way to share this? And hence this book. But true romance readers typically read like 3 of these books a week. I mean, there are people who are so into it. And that's frankly not me. I really almost don't want to say this because people are going to say, why should I read your book then? But I did learn a lot about it. I mean, the book is based on lots and lots of research, but it's not my jam.
I mean, ultimately, your impact or the goal you're trying to achieve is that this is a tool for women to feel empowered, for women to feel seen, for women to feel that they have an avenue to express themselves, right?
Right. I mean, romance, if you look at the history of the genre, there was that unfortunate bodice ripper stage of the romance genre. But in its origins and in its current incarnation, romance is a really political tool. In the early days of the romance novel, there was this reaction to it on the part of the publishing establishment. On the one hand, they hated it. They hated the idea that women were writing and reading stories about women's desire. But on the other hand, those books made a mint for the publishing industry. So they kept publishing them. So the origins are political. The origins are, hey, let's acknowledge and celebrate women's desire. But for many, many years, it was very one track. It was straight, thin, white women who got into a romance with a man. Now we're at this point where it's not just young characters, it's not just able bodied characters, it's not just white characters. It's a much bigger tent, and there's room for late life romance. And there's room for us to use romance as a tool to expand our concept of what it's like to be an older woman.
So what does your like typical person that you're targeting look like to take a class or something? I mean, I'm sure that's not typical just like anything else, but who's seeking this out?
Okay, let me think about who was in those classes that I was teaching online. Those folks were all over 65. I would say that my book really, I'm looking at people of every age, but probably most people who read this book and use this book to write their stories mostly are going to be women, mostly going to be over 50. That's what I have in mind. But again, in the same way that you don't have to be young to write a young character, There's no reason why a woman in her 40s or a man in his 30s can't write about and celebrate older women and older men. I would like to think that women and men who read romance and are frustrated by how difficult it is to find books with older characters would take the leap and use this book to write their own. So I don't just see this book as being a tool for established writers, although it's fine for them. But I would like it to appeal to people who are readers and who would like to have a bigger universe to look at.
So there's a question that I often ask, which is to try to understand personal evolution. So let me say, like, you've come from a corporate background, you've been a mother, you've been a partner. Do you have a sense of really being able to talk about how you've gotten braver, how you've gotten more political? We talk about the uniqueness of older women as agents of change because they care less about their reputation or because they're no longer in a corporate position. How has that played out for you?
I turned 60 thinking, on the one hand, that that was going to be a terrible decade because there were all these social constructs about becoming a decrepit older person. And on the other hand, I think by the time I turned 60, I pretty much knew that all that stuff was a joke because I felt great. And I remember at my 60th birthday party, people coming up to me and saying, "You don't look 60." And I remember thinking, "Yeah, I do. Of course I look 60. I am 60." So, where did all this come from? Where did these ideas come from that we're all internalizing and living, and how do we get rid of all that? So, there's been this whole gradual process of awakening to the indoctrination, frankly, that we had when we were younger. The whole Disney princess thing, that if you were young, you were beautiful and kind of passive. But if you were an older woman, you were Maleficent or Ursula.
Yeah, which
And not just a witch, but a caricature. I mean, I know plenty of women who are witches, and there are tons of what are called pagantarians, and they're wonderful people. But we have this concept in our culture of the older woman, and it's starting to change. And it's been interesting that my own process of change has happened at the same time as we're seeing, Hacks winning a ton of Emmys, and Emma Thompson in a movie where she celebrates older women's sexuality. And so much is happening. Joan Price writing Naked at Our Age. So many terrific things are happening.
there's that Instagram group, something broad, that features older women in New York City living their best life. They talk about sex, they talk about having fun. They're fashionable, like they defy all the stereotypes.
And I'm involved politically here in North Carolina with a group that is fiercely progressive, and it's all older women and getting out the vote, supporting women's reproductive freedom. It's a big deal here in North Carolina. We are in a state that could improve or not. And we have a person running for governor who is on the record as supporting ending women's suffrage. So older women are big change makers in politics and in many other ways too. I mean,
They stand up when they see injustice. And there's something, what I've really noticed is so many people will just tell me, like, I just realized that I'm not so concerned that I'm pleasing a partner, or I'm not so concerned that my boss likes me. So all of those things that constrain have been removed by older age.
there is so much freedom.
Yeah, that's really, I just think it's so incredible to keep realizing from one person to the next that I connect with who are going at it, right? You've got your own tool and your own how to and your own way of getting at the same issues.
If you think about Nancy Pelosi, this is a person who was a successful attorney her whole life, but she didn't feel she could really get into politics, which was her goal, until her last child graduated high school. Now, what man would feel that they were limited to not starting their dream career until their last kid graduated high school? But for women, that moment when your responsibilities lift, because we do take on, by and large, mostly it's women who take on the big share of child rearing. So you get to this moment where your last child graduates high school, you're looking at the end of your career that you've had to support your kids to get to that point, and the world opens up. And the things that you always wanted to do, but never had the bandwidth to do, are suddenly reachable. They're suddenly in your sights. It is a fantastic moment for women. And of course, there are many women who aren't in a position to stop working when they get to that point. And there are women who take on rearing their grandchildren. So this is not a universal experience. It is to some extent a privileged experience. But I think we can all support policies that will enable more and more women to get to that point. Things like having a baseline Social Security payment, things like supporting wage equity for women, all the ways that we can set up the next generation of women to have this experience of this freedom. And certainly supporting reproductive freedom is key to that goal of enabling more and more women to have that moment of freedom that they reach in their 60s.
Well, it's almost like the ones who have the privilege now, if we could even emphasize that privilege comes with responsibility, which is to enable that for others.
Yes, exactly. But again, I think that creativity is a route to make that sense of freedom available to more and more women, so that no matter where you find yourself when you're 60, if there are books you can read, if there are shows you can watch that talk about the promise of the years ahead, that's one way to start empowering all of us.
Yeah, it changes the decisions that you make about how you're setting yourself even up for a future. If you're imagining the future as being shrunk and being old and being afraid of being a grandmother, so many women don't want to be called grandma because it means that they're old and irrelevant. We shift all of that, and women are recognizing freedom is coming, then they're setting themselves up in a different way, I think, for that. So, Stella, what's next for you? You have another book on the way. What are you doing next?
I have been blogging and writing guest blogs and doing essays all over the place throughout my 60s. So I have started pulling together the best of those essays, and they cluster around a couple themes. There are the essays about creativity and the importance of creativity for women of a certain age, as we call ourselves sometimes. There are lots of essays about older women's health, because having been in biotech, when I encounter medical ageism, medical sexism, the two of them together, I have lots of opinions about that. And I talk about how to empower ourselves in our interactions with the medical community. Money. I also briefly had a career in finance before I switched into biotech. And so I write about the struggles older women can have with money and how to work with those struggles. And then, of course, I write about older women's sexuality and how our sexuality and our creativity are linked. So, those are some of the themes that I found that I have when I look at all these essays together. So, my next book is going to be called What to Expect When You're 60. And the subtitle is Adventures in the Secretly Wonderful Decade. So that book, I don't know when that book is going to be out. I'm actively working on it in between working on publicity for the current book, but I'm hoping end of the year. So we'll see.
So, moving away from the erotica creativity, but still sticking with aging.
Yeah, although again, I have essays about creativity and sexuality.
You're reminding me, we have Mary Pfeiffer's book coming up in our book club. She really says exactly what you're saying, which is that women find themselves in this incredible space of happiness.
Yeah. Well, you know about the U-shaped curve, right?
Yes. I'm in the bottom of it right now.
You're Yeah, my kids seem to be down there too. It's
Yeah, I'm definitely down at the bottom of that, dealing with all the family, child rearing, career muck. But that's why I feel like it's so important for us to have these intergenerational conversations as well, because it is so nice to know there's a different future and it's not like this forever.
the Gina Davis Institute studies about media representation of older women, and they've had a report since then, but they had a report at one point that was called Frail, Frumpy, and Forgotten. And they're continuing to show that media representations of older women typically show us as we have dementia, we're frail, we're in some very little subordinate role in the movie. The main characters are young people, but the older people, especially the older
Or
women,
their comedic relief, maybe.
yeah, right. It's some deal where they're making fun of the frailties or forgetfulness, let's say, of an older woman. But the representations of tough, assertive, funny older women, that's kind of missing. So, yes, we absolutely need to have representation of strong older women so that women in their 30s and 40s can see that where they're going is a good place.
Wow, Stella, I so appreciate you coming and sharing your perspectives on this and your journey. I've learned a lot today. It was really thoughtful conversation.
Yeah, it's been great. Can I say one more thing? Well, two things. One is I am super jazzed about the Grandmother Collective. I am super interested in getting involved with the whole storytelling aspect of the Grandmother Collective. Changing the narrative is just the key thing that we all need to be doing. And the fact that the Grandmother Collective is looking across cultures brings this fantastic level of perspective that I'm not seeing anyplace else. So I'm just really jazzed. That's one thing. The other thing I want to say is that I'm also jazzed about is that I'm starting to hear back from women who are using my book, Well Seasoned Romance, to write their novels. Already, there's a woman who's going to be sending me a novelette that she wrote based on the book. And of course, I'm happy to read it and give feedback. So that's terrific. Another woman wrote to me and said that she is taking the book to her writing group and she's going to suggest that they all together as a group write a romance novel, which I think is a fantastic way to use the book. So you were saying earlier about the book being a tool. This is exactly what's happening with it, which is what I hoped would happen. That the fact that this book exists is opening doors to expand the universe of what's out there for older women reading romance.
It feels so good when you get that kind of feedback. So, congratulations. It's so when like you taught something and someone tells you later, like, I still use that. That's the best feeling. So, awesome. Congratulations. And thank you for being part of us. We're happy to have you.
Well, great. That is terrific. All right. Thanks so much for this discussion. I really enjoyed it.
Thanks, Stella.